I still remember the smell of burning paper. I stood frozen in that room, watching my brother Draven Sterling hold our grandmother's $8 million will over the fireplace flames, smiling, not crying, not raging, smiling. The rest of the room was silent, and I felt the floor disappear beneath me. But what Draven didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ianthe Whitlock had seen this moment coming long before any of us, and she had already built the answer. But to understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what happened in the 6 years before it. I moved into Ianthe's house on a Thursday in early October. I remember because the leaves on the oak trees lining her driveway had just started to turn, amber and rust at the edges, still green at the center, like something beautiful refusing to let go all at once. I had a suitcase, a laptop bag, and a quiet arrangement with myself. I would stay until she didn't need me anymore. I didn't know then that, until she didn't need me anymore, would mean until the morning she stopped breathing. The house was a colonial revival on the outskirts of Ashford, Virginia. Wide white columns, black shutters, a garden in the back that Ianthe had tended herself until her hands made it too difficult. 3 floors, 7 bedrooms. A library on the second floor that smelled of cedar and old paper, where she kept first editions behind glass and a photograph of her late husband on the corner shelf, turned slightly away from the window, as though he preferred shade. The house had the particular silence of a place that had once been full of people and had learned to carry that fullness alone. Ianthe Whitlock was 81 when I arrived. She had been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition the previous spring, not the kind that takes memory first, but the kind that takes the body while leaving the mind completely intact, which, if you knew Ianthe, you understood was both a mercy and a particular cruelty. She was sharp until the end, sharper than most people half her age. She read the financial news every morning with a second cup of coffee and could recall the exact date of any conversation she'd had in the past 3 years. She forgot nothing. She forgave selectively, and she watched people the way a chess player watches the board, not with anxiety, but with the patient certainty that every piece eventually reveals its nature. She never asked me to come. She would never have asked. That was not who she was. I came because I saw what was happening, and I made a choice. My career at the time, I had been building a position at an urban planning consultancy in Baltimore, 3 years in, the kind of slow upward climb that requires consistent presence and visible ambition. I left it without ceremony. I told my supervisor I had a family situation. He was understanding in the way that people are understanding when they know they'll be replacing you within the month. I packed the suitcase. I drove south. What I did not do was tell Draven. Not because I was hiding it, because it didn't occur to me that he needed to know. Draven Sterling lived in Phoenix at the time, in a condo he'd bought with money our grandmother had given him after their father, our father, died. He called Ianthe on birthdays and occasionally in December. He sent flowers twice a year, always the same arrangement, always accompanied by a card signed with just his name and no message. He was not estranged from her exactly. He was simply absent in the way that some people are absent, physically elsewhere and emotionally unavailable even when present, so that his absence registered as something closer to relief than loss. I made breakfast every morning at 7. I drove Ianthe to her appointments, neurology, cardiology, the ophthalmologist she'd been seeing for 15 years and trusted completely. I managed her medications, which by the second year had grown into a chart that required its own laminated reference sheet on the refrigerator. I handled correspondence with her financial advisor, her accountant, her insurance providers. I learned more about estate law in those 6 years than I ever intended to know. Not because I was planning anything, but because Ianthe wanted me to understand what she had and why it was structured the way it was. And she explained things in the language of someone who expected you to keep up. She never thanked me. Not in the sentimental way people imagine. She was not a woman who said, "I don't know what I'd do without you," or pressed your hand while her eyes filled with tears. What she did, occasionally, was look at me across the dinner table with an expression I can only describe as recognition. The look of someone seeing not what you're doing, but who you are. That was enough. For 6 years, it was enough. The flashbacks to Draven during those years came in the form of phone calls. The first time he called asking for money was 8 months after I moved in. Ianthe took the call in the library. I was in the kitchen and could hear only her side. Clipped, precise, non-committal. Afterward, she came to the doorway and said, without drama, "He wants $40,000. He says it's an investment opportunity." She said it the way she might announce the weather. I asked what she told him. She said, "I told him I'd think about it." She never mentioned it again. I don't know if she sent the money. The second call I remember came 2 years later. I happened to be in the room, organizing files at the desk in the corner. Draven's voice was audible through the phone. Warm, practiced, effortlessly charming. He was telling her about a difficult stretch, a business that hadn't gone the way he'd planned, a partner who'd let him down. His voice had that quality that his voice always had, the sound of someone who has never once doubted that the world would accommodate him. Ianthe listened without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "Draven, you are not a man who has had bad luck. You are a man who has made choices. Those are different things." There was a silence on the line. Then he laughed, the way he always laughed when someone said something he didn't want to hear. Smooth, dismissive, as though she'd made a small joke. She set the phone down and looked at the window for a moment before returning to what she'd been reading. I think about that sentence now more than almost anything else she ever said. You are not a man who has had bad luck. You are a man who has made choices. At the time, I thought it was simply Ianthe being precise, refusing the soft language of victimhood, applying the same clear-eyed standards she applied to everyone. Now I think it was something else. I think it was the beginning of a verdict. Because somewhere in those last years, Ianthe Whitlock stopped simply observing her grandson and started preparing for what she already knew he would do. I didn't see it then. I was too close, too tired, too deep inside the daily rhythm of medications and meals and medical files to look up long enough to notice what she was quietly, methodically building. In the margins of her days, in the meetings she took alone, in the calls she made from the library with the door closed. I know now that in August of the year before she died, she made a phone call to a lawyer named Lorcan Hart. I know what she asked him to prepare. I know she gave him specific instructions and made him repeat them back to her twice before she was satisfied. If you've ever sat with someone in the last months of their life, you know the particular quality of their attention, the way they sometimes look at ordinary things as though making a final accounting. A garden, a doorframe, a person standing in a kitchen. There were moments in that last year when I caught Ianthe watching me with something in her expression that I could not name at the time. I can name it now. She was making sure. If you're watching from somewhere you feel that weight, that quiet accumulation of years given to someone else without applause or witness, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are and whether any part of this feels familiar. Because I don't think Neera's story is as rare as the world pretends it is. I did not know, the night before the reading of the will, that I was about to walk into the most carefully constructed room Ianthe Whitlock had ever built. I thought I was walking into an ending. I was wrong. I was walking into the first line of something she had been writing for months, a document not made of paper, but of precision and patience, and the ruthless clarity of a woman who loved one grandchild enough to protect her from the other. What I didn't yet understand was that the most important thing Ianthe had ever prepared for me wasn't in that room at all. Ianthe died on a Tuesday. It was 5:43 in the morning, and the house was the color of pewter. That particular gray that exists only in the minutes before dawn decides what kind of day it intends to be. I had been awake for most of the night, not because I sensed something, the way people in stories always claim to sense these things, but because the house had a specific quality of silence that night that was different from its usual silence. Harder, somehow. More deliberate. Like a held breath. I was sitting in the chair beside her bed when it happened. Not holding her hand. She had never liked to be held in sleep. Had always maintained a precise physical boundary, even in her final months. I was simply present. Reading nothing. Watching the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the white coverlet, the lamp on the nightstand casting a low amber circle that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. And then the rising and falling stopped. That was all. No drama. No last words. No reaching toward something unseen. She simply ceased, the way a sentence ends. Not with noise, but with the absence of continuation. I sat with her for several minutes before I called anyone. I don't apologize for that. Those minutes belonged to her and to me and to the 6 years between us that no one else had witnessed. The funeral home came. The calls were made. The arrangements, which Ianthe had organized in meticulous detail 2 years prior and left in a manila folder in the top drawer of her desk with the label, "When the time comes, do not improvise," were executed precisely as she had specified. White lilies, not roses. No recorded music. A reading from Marcus Aurelius, which she had selected herself and which I practiced aloud twice in the bathroom the night before because I was determined not to falter. Draven arrived the morning of the viewing. I knew he was there before I saw him. I heard the particular quality of the room change, the slight uptick in attention, the soft recalibration of posture that happens when someone compelling enters a space. Draven Sterling was, by every external measure, a beautiful man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with Ianthe's bone structure and none of her interiority. He had the kind of face that reads as trustworthy from a distance. Open, warm, slightly weathered in a way that suggested experience rather than damage. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him perfectly, and a tie that was just one shade lighter. He had clearly considered what to wear to his grandmother's funeral. He embraced me at the door. Long, firm, the kind of hug that communicates grief to everyone watching. I stood inside it and felt nothing except the faint smell of his cologne. Cedar, and something synthetic underneath, like the idea of nature rather than nature itself. "Naira," he said, pulling back to hold my face in both hands the way our father used to. She was something, wasn't she? Not a question, a performance. Yes, I said. She was. And then he was gone. Into the room, moving through clusters of people with the practiced ease of someone who has never once been uncomfortable in a crowd. I watched him from the doorway. He spoke to Ianthe's neighbors, her former colleagues, the women from her garden club who had driven 40 minutes in the January cold to pay their respects. He listened with his whole body, leaning forward, nodding slowly, placing a hand on an arm at precisely the right moment. He made each person feel, for the 2 minutes he gave them, that they were the most important person in the room. It was extraordinary to watch, and it would have been moving if I had not known him. I had known Draven my entire life. I had sat across from him at enough dinner tables, in enough living rooms, in enough cars on long drives to understand what his attention felt like from the inside, which was different from what it looked like from the outside. From the outside, it looked like warmth. From the inside, it felt like being assessed. Every conversation with Draven had the quality of a transaction in which the terms were never explicitly stated, but were always present, running beneath the surface like a current beneath still water. He gave you his charm the way someone places a bet. He was always waiting to collect. We did not have a moment alone at the viewing. He made sure of that, in the way that people who are avoiding a conversation make sure of it, by staying visible, staying in motion, staying surrounded. I was not surprised. I had expected something like this. What I had not expected was the phone call. It came at 11:47 that night. I was in the kitchen at Ianthe's house. My house now. I didn't know yet the specific contours of what that meant, but I felt the weight of it. Drinking tea I didn't particularly want, staring at the garden through the dark window. The phone screen lit up with his name, and I considered not answering. Then I answered. His voice, when it came, was different from the voice he'd been using all day. The warmth was still there, technically. The cadence was the same, the measured ease, but something underneath it had shifted, like a thermostat lowered by a single degree. Enough to feel, not enough to name in the moment. "I just wanted to check on you," he said. "It's a lot, being here, carrying all of this." "I'm fine," I said. "You know," he continued, and I heard the slight pause before he continued, the half-beat that in Draven always preceded something he had rehearsed. "I've been thinking about what comes next. For the house, for the estate. It's complicated. There are things I know about grandmother's finances that might be relevant." I waited. "I just think," he said, "that it would be better for everyone if we approached this as a family, together, before lawyers start making things unnecessarily adversarial." I said, "The reading is tomorrow at 2, Draven." A beat of silence. "Right," he said, and the warmth in his voice recalibrated. Thinner now, just slightly, like fabric pulled one thread too tight. "Of course, I'll see you there." He ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. Outside, the garden was black and still. Somewhere in the oak tree at the far end of the property, something shifted. A branch, a bird, the night itself settling into its own weight. I had no proof of anything. No specific threat had been made. Nothing he said could be pointed to as evidence of intent. That was always the way with Draven. The danger was never in what he said. It was in what he was preparing to do after the call ended. I went to bed at midnight. I did not sleep. At 1:58 the following afternoon, I walked through the front door of Lorcan Hart's office on Clement Street, a narrow brownstone with brass fittings on the door, and a waiting room that smelled of wool carpet and old wood, and I sat down in the chair across from the man who had been Ianthe's attorney for 11 years. He greeted me with a handshake that was firm and brief, and told me nothing about what he knew. Draven arrived 4 minutes later. He was wearing a different suit, charcoal this time, almost black. He sat to my left, 1 chair away, and did not look at me. He crossed one leg over the other and rested his hands in his lap with the particular stillness of a man who is waiting and who is very good at waiting. Lorcanhart opened the folder on his desk and cleared his throat. I did not know what I was about to hear. I did not know what Draven was about to do. I did not know that the woman we had buried the day before had left us both something, but that only one of us would understand, standing there in the ruins of the next 20 minutes, what her gift actually meant. The room was very quiet. Lorcanhart began to read. Lorcanhart had the kind of voice that belonged in a room like that one. Not loud, not theatrical. It was a low, even voice, the voice of a man who had read difficult documents aloud to grieving families enough times to understand that the words themselves carried sufficient weight without any added pressure from tone or emphasis. He read the way a surgeon operates, precise, unhurried, without visible emotion. The folder was open in front of him. His hands were flat on the desk on either side of it. The room was small, dark wood paneling, 2 tall windows with the blinds angled to let in light without allowing a direct view of the street. A clock on the wall to my right that I could hear ticking when nothing else was happening. 3 chairs, 1 for Lorcan, 1 for me, 1 for Draven, arranged in a configuration that felt almost conversational, almost intimate. The kind of room where people received news they had been waiting for, and news they were not prepared to receive, sometimes at the same time. I had my hands folded in my lap. I was not aware of making that choice. My coat was draped over the back of the chair. I had not taken off my scarf. Draven sat with one leg crossed, left hand resting on the armrest, right hand loose at his side. His posture was the posture of a man who is comfortable, who expects comfort. The posture of someone who has spent his entire life arriving at rooms and finding them arranged in his favor. Lorcan began with the standard language. The full name of the testator, Ianthe Marguerite Whitlock, date of document execution, country and state of residence, declarations of sound mind and lawful intent. His voice moved through the preamble with the efficiency of someone who knew that preamble was not what anyone was there for. I watched the second hand on the clock. I watched Draven's left hand on the armrest. Still. Completely still. Then Lorcan reached the substance. The first item was the library. Ianthe's books, all 412 volumes, including the first editions, were to be donated to the Ashford County Public Library, with a designated reading room established in her name. A sum of $40,000 was allocated for the room's construction and maintenance. Draven did not move. The second item was the garden. A specific bequest of $22,000 to the Ashford Horticultural Society, with the instruction that the funds be used to establish a scholarship for young women pursuing degrees in landscape architecture. Draven uncrossed and recrossed his legs. The third item was the jewelry. Ianthe had 3 pieces of significant value: a pearl necklace, a diamond brooch that had belonged to her own mother, and a sapphire ring that she had worn every day for 40 years without exception. All 3 pieces were bequeathed to me, specifically, without qualification. Lorcan read my name, and I heard it land in the room like something solid. Draven's hand tightened on the armrest. Just slightly. If you were not watching for it, you would not have seen it. I was watching for it. The fourth item was the investment accounts. Ianthe had maintained 3 separate portfolios over the course of her lifetime. Conservative, methodical, built over decades through decisions that were never flashy and never wrong. Their combined value at the time of document execution was listed at $4,200,000. They were to pass entirely to me, with instructions to maintain a minimum of 1 qualified financial advisor and to avoid any single instrument concentration above 30%. Even in the distribution of her wealth, Ianthe could not resist giving instructions. Draven was no longer still. He had shifted in his chair. Small movement, controlled, but movement nonetheless. His jaw had changed. Not clenched exactly. Set. The way a door is set in a frame before someone puts a hand on the handle. The 5th item was the house. The colonial revival on the outskirts of Ashford, Virginia, the white columns and black shutters and the oak trees along the driveway and the library on the 2nd floor, and the garden in the back where I had spent 6 years moving through morning light, carrying medications and trays in quiet determination, along with all its contents, its grounds, and its appurtenant property, was bequeathed in full and without condition to me. The total value of the estate, Lorcan said without inflection, was approximately $8 million. Then Lorcan turned to the next page. His voice did not change. That was what I will always remember. He read Draven's bequest in exactly the same tone he had read everything else. Measured, neutral, without the slight softening that people sometimes use when delivering disappointment, as though gentleness of delivery can soften the content itself. He did not soften it. He read it as Ianthe had written it. To my grandson, Draven Thomas Sterling, I leave the following. Nothing further. You have already received, during my lifetime, what I determined to be your portion. I trust you understand the accounting. The clock on the wall ticked. That was all Draven received. A sentence. Not even a sum. A sentence that functioned as both a door closing and a key turning in the lock. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. I counted them by the clock. 4 seconds in a room like that is a very long time. And then Draven moved. He did not shout. That is important. He did not stand up and rage or knock the chair backward or say something that could be quoted later as evidence of instability. What he did was quieter and, in its quietness, more frightening. He rose from the chair in a single fluid motion, controlled, almost graceful, and crossed the 2 steps between himself and Lorcan's desk before either of us had fully registered that he was standing. He reached across the desk with one hand and took the document. Not snatched. Took. The way someone takes something they believe already belongs to them. Lorcan said, Mr. Sterling. Draven had already turned toward the fireplace. The fireplace in that office was decorative, a narrow insert with a marble surround, the kind that exists in old brownstones as architectural remnant rather than functional feature. It was lit that afternoon. I don't know why it was lit. Perhaps Lorcan simply preferred the room that way in January. Perhaps Ianthe had known it would be lit and had chosen this office in this season for this specific reading. I wonder about that now. I wonder about it more than I should. Draven held the document over the fire. He looked at me while he did it. That is the part I have returned to more than any other in the years since. Not the act itself, not the paper catching at the corner, the small orange tongue of flame moving upward, the document beginning its slow erasure. The part I have returned to is his face while it happened, the expression he wore while he watched me watch him destroy what our grandmother had built. He was smiling. Not a triumphant smile, not a cruel one exactly. Something more unsettling than either. The smile of a man who is finally, after a very long time, saying out loud what he has always believed. That things go the way I decide they go. The paper burned completely in under 2 minutes. He let the last corner fall into the grate. Then he turned to Lorcan and said, in a voice that was almost pleasant, Without a valid will, the estate passes by intestate succession. I suggest you look up the applicable statute. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. I'll be in touch, he said. To Lorcan, not to me. And then he walked out. If you are watching this right now, if you just saw what I saw and you're sitting with that the way I sat with it, I need to ask you something. What would you have done? In that room, with the ashes still in the grate, with nothing but 6 years of your life reduced to smoke in under 2 minutes. Tell me in the comments. I want to know. I did not move for a long time after he left. Lorcan was speaking. I could see his mouth moving, could hear the shape of words, something about procedure and next steps and statute, and his voice coming through the way voices come through water. I was looking at the fireplace, at the gray residue in the grate that had, 3 minutes ago, been the last formal record of what Ianthe had intended. I drove home in silence. No music, no calls. The January light was already thinning by 4 in the afternoon, the sky going pale and flat the way Virginia skies go in winter, as though the color has been gently pressed out of them. I sat in the driveway of the house for 11 minutes before I went inside. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard until I could make myself open the door. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it. Ianthe's coat still on the hook by the back door. Her reading glasses on the side table in the sitting room. The smell of cedar and old paper drifting down from the library. Everything exactly as it had always been. Indifferent to what had just happened 3 miles away in a room with a lit fireplace. I sat at the kitchen table and I did not cry. I want to be precise about that. I did not cry because what I felt was not grief exactly. It was something older and colder and more structural. The feeling of a floor giving way. The feeling of realizing that a thing you had built your life around for 6 years could be erased in less time than it takes to make a cup of tea. I went to bed at 9. Not because I was tired, because I could not find another reason to stay awake. I did not set an alarm. At 5:17 in the morning, someone knocked on my door. 5:17 in the morning is not a time when people bring good news. I know that sounds like something a person says looking backward, with the advantage of knowing how things turned out. But I mean it in the literal sense. In the moment, standing at the top of the stairs in the dark, hearing the knock come again, slow and deliberate, 2 beats with a pause between them, I felt nothing that resembled hope. I felt the specific dread of someone who has already lost something and is now waiting to find out what comes next in the sequence of losing. I came down the stairs in my coat over my clothes. I had slept dressed, which tells you something about the state I was in, and I stood at the front door for a moment with my hand on the knob. The porch light was on. Through the narrow glass panel beside the door, I could see the shape of a man standing very still, a dark rectangle tucked under one arm. Not shifting his weight, not checking his phone, just standing, the way someone stands when they are entirely certain they are in the right place. I opened the door. Lorcan Hart looked the same as he had looked the previous afternoon, which was either a testament to his composure or an indication that what he was carrying had given him something to stand inside of, a certainty that made ordinary things like sleep and the passage of hours temporarily irrelevant. He was wearing a dark overcoat. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. The black folder under his arm was secured with a single brass clasp. He said, "I'm sorry for the hour." She was specific about the timing. I stepped back from the door. He came inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat the night before staring at nothing, and he placed the black folder between us without opening it yet. He folded his hands on top of it. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is finally in the room where he is allowed to set it down. "Before I show you what's in here," he said, "I want you to understand something about your grandmother. What she asked me to do, what she planned. This was not reactive. She did not decide to do this after Draven did something specific. She decided to do this because she knew Draven. Completely. She had known him his entire life, and she knew that knowledge was not going to change him. So she worked with what she knew." He paused. "She came to my office on the 14th of August, he continued, 8 months before she died. She was in a wheelchair by then. Her aide drove her. She arrived at 9 in the morning, declined tea, and told me she needed 2 hours of my time and complete confidentiality. What she described to me in those 2 hours was the most methodical estate protection strategy I have encountered in 31 years of practice." He opened the brass clasp. The folder contained a document in a clear protective sleeve. Cream paper, the kind that has a slight weight and texture to it, the kind that is used for things that are meant to last. I could see Ianthe's signature at the bottom of the visible page, in her particular handwriting. Upright, spare, each letter formed with the precision of someone who had been taught penmanship at a time when penmanship was considered a form of character. Beside her signature were 4 others, and a 5th on a separate attestation page. 5 witnesses, Lorcan said, all unrelated to the family, all of legal age and sound mind, individually interviewed and verified. The document was executed in triplicate. 1 copy remained with me, sealed in my office safe. 1 copy was deposited in a fireproof safety deposit box at First Federal Bank on Clement Street, accessible only upon presentation of a specific notarized authorization that your grandmother pre-signed and left with the branch manager. The 3rd copy, he paused again, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the controlled equivalent of one, was the copy she placed in the reading room yesterday. The room was very quiet. Outside, the first birds of morning had started, faint, tentative, the kind of bird sound that exists in the dark before dawn, as though testing whether the world is ready yet. I looked at the document in the sleeve. I looked at Ianthe's signature. I thought about her sitting in Lorcan's office on the 14th of August in a wheelchair she hated, declining tea she didn't want, spending 2 hours in precise and deliberate conversation with a man she trusted, building something that would survive her, building it not in grief, not in bitterness, in clarity. She chose what went into the reading, I said. It was not a question. It came out of my mouth as a statement because the moment I understood it, it was simply true. She chose everything, Lorcan said. The specific copy placed in that room, the fireplace. She asked me to ensure the room was warm, and that office has only one heat source. She knew Draven would not leave that room without destroying what he could reach. She planned for it. I sat with that for a moment. The specific architecture of what Ianthe had constructed was becoming visible to me the way a building becomes visible when you step far enough back from it. Not piece by piece, but all at once. The whole structure. the proportions, the deliberate placement of every element. She had handed him the match. She had positioned the fireplace. She had put a copy of the document, an exact, perfect, legally meaningless copy, within his reach, in a room with an open flame, because she knew her grandson, because she had watched him his entire life with the same patient, undeceived attention she applied to everything, and she had known, with the certainty of someone who has long since stopped hoping to be wrong, that he would take it, that he would burn it, that he would do it in front of a witness, with the slow, satisfied deliberateness of a man who believed he had just won. She had built him a stage, and he had performed exactly as directed. "The recording," I said. Lorcan reached into the folder and produced a second item, a small sealed envelope with a single word written on it in Ianthe's handwriting. The word was evidence. "She contacted a firm that specializes in legal documentation services," he said. The reading room was equipped with 2 small audio-visual recording devices, installed the previous week under authorization I provided as officer of the estate. The recording captures the full reading, Draven's removal of the document, the destruction, his statement regarding intestate succession, and his departure. It is time-stamped, unedited, and admissible. I looked at the envelope with Ianthe's handwriting on it. She had not simply protected the will. She had anticipated the crime and turned it into its own undoing. She had known that a legal document, however valid, could be challenged, delayed, subjected to the particular grinding attrition of Draven's resources, and charm and willingness to cause damage. So she had given the court something better than a will. She had given the court Draven destroying a will on camera, followed by a verbal declaration of his intent to claim intestate succession, a declaration made in front of a licensed attorney who was also the estate's executor. She had not just written a will. She had written a trap. And she had written it in August, 8 months before she needed it, because she understood that the only way to defeat a man like Draven was not to react to what he did, but to prepare for it so completely that his action became, at the moment of its commission, the final argument against him. "She told me something," Lorcan said, and his voice was slightly different now, still controlled, but with something underneath it that I recognized after a moment as respect. Simple, unglamorous respect. When she left the office in August, her aide had brought the wheelchair to the door and she was being helped into it, and she turned back to me and said, "I wrote it down afterward because I knew I would want to remember it." She said, "Lorcan, I have spent my entire life building things carefully. I see no reason to stop now." I pressed my hand flat on the table, not to steady myself, just to feel something solid. The implications of what Lorcan was laying out moved through me in sequence, each one arriving with the weight of something that had been true for months and was only now becoming visible. The legal position was clear: a properly executed will registered in triplicate with 5 witnesses, and a notarized deposit authorization was not a document that could be challenged by a man who had been caught on camera destroying a copy of it while verbally announcing his legal strategy. Draven had not just failed to destroy the will. He had, in the act of trying, produced the single most damaging piece of evidence that could possibly be used against him. Ianthe had known he would. "What happens to him now?" I asked. Lorcan folded his hands. "That," he said, "depends entirely on how far he wants to take this." He left the original will on the table, inside its protective sleeve, beside the sealed envelope with the single word in Ianthe's handwriting. He told me his office would file the necessary paperwork by the end of the business day. He told me the bank had been notified. He told me that if Draven retained counsel and initiated a contest, which was his right, however ill-advised, the matter would be resolved in a court that now had access to a recording of the alleged contest in real time. He stood, put on his coat, and shook my hand. At the door he paused and looked back at the kitchen, at the table, at the folder, at the morning light that had begun to come through the window while we talked, thin and gray gold and completely indifferent to everything that had just shifted in that room. "She loved you very much," he said. She was not a woman who said it easily. But this, he gestured briefly at the folder. This is what love looks like in the language she spoke. He left. I stood at the door until his car had turned out of the driveway, and the sound of the engine had faded into the cold morning air. Then I sat back down at the kitchen table. In my hand was the original will, intact, witnessed, registered, irrefutable. On the table was the envelope with the single word in Ianthe's writing. Outside, the light was fully coming now, and the oak trees along the driveway were beginning to separate themselves from the dark, their bare branches resolving into individual lines against the sky. I sat there for a long time. I was trying to understand the full shape of what she had given me. Not just the estate, not just the house and the accounts and the jewelry and 40 years of careful accumulation. Something else. The knowledge that someone had seen what was coming and had stood in its path and had refused, with everything she had, right up until August, right up until her last months, right up until she no longer had the strength to walk to the car unassisted, to let it land on me unopposed. Draven did not know yet what was waiting for him. By noon that day, he would. People ask me sometimes what the legal battle was like. I tell them the truth. There was no battle. There was a consequence. Draven retained a lawyer. A good one, the kind that costs enough to signal seriousness. And that lawyer, upon reviewing the documentation Lorcan submitted and watching approximately 4 minutes of the recording, advised his client in terms I was not present for, but can reasonably reconstruct from everything I know about Draven's particular relationship with reality. He would have been told that the will was valid, witnessed, registered, and unassailable. He would have been told that the recording was clear, time-stamped, and admissible. He would have been told that a man who destroys estate documents on camera and then verbally announces his intention to claim intestate succession in front of the estate's executor has not committed a strategic error. He has committed a document that a court will read with considerable interest. He would have been told, in the careful language of someone who charges $400 an hour and cannot afford to be misunderstood, that proceeding would not merely fail. It would accelerate and confirm every element of the case against him. Draven's challenge lasted 53 days, not because the law moved slowly. Because Draven, I think, needed 53 days to arrive at the particular interior reckoning of a man who has spent his entire life operating on the assumption that things bend toward him, and who must now face, in the precise and unforgiving language of a court filing, the evidence that they do not, that they never did, that the one person in his life who had appeared to bend toward him, who had given him money and patience and decades of access to her warmth, had seen him clearly all along, had seen him and had loved him anyway, in the way that honest people love difficult ones, without illusion, without surrender, and without leaving the door unlocked. The estate was transferred into my name on a Thursday in March. I remember that it was Thursday again because the leaves on the oak trees along the driveway were beginning, in the way of very early spring, to show the first suggestion of green at the tips. Not leaves yet, just the idea of leaves, the faint biological announcement that something was returning. I stood in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The white columns, the black shutters. The garden in the back still gray and dormant but present, still there, waiting for the season to give it permission to begin again. I had been inside the house hundreds of times since Ianthe died. I had walked its hallways, slept in my room on the second floor, made coffee in her kitchen, sat in the library with the first editions behind their glass. But this was the first time I walked through the front door with the legal weight of the place fully transferred. The first time the house was mine, not in the provisional, caretaking sense in which it had been mine for 6 years, but in the permanent, documented, undisputed sense that Ianthe had spent months ensuring it would be. It felt different, heavier and lighter at the same time, the way significant things often do. Before I tell you what I found, if you have stayed with this story from the first minute to this one, if Naira's voice has meant something to you tonight, I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment. Tell me what this story brought up for you. Hit the like button if you believe that quiet people, patient people, people who give without announcing it, deserve to be seen. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because what comes next is the part of this story I have thought about every single day since I found it. And I want you here for it. I did not go looking for the letter. That is the thing I want to be precise about. I was not searching. I was not conducting some systematic review of Ianthe's belongings with the expectation of finding something. I had been in her room many times since she died. First to manage her things, later simply because the room held a quality of her presence that I was not yet ready to surrender. Her reading glasses still on the side table. The photograph of her husband still turned slightly away from the window. The cedar smell that had permanently worked its way into the walls and the curtains and the grain of the wooden furniture, so that entering that room was, in a specific sensory way, still entering her. I was looking for her winter cardigan, the gray one with the deep pockets that she had worn every evening in the last year, the one I had washed and folded and placed somewhere I could no longer remember. A completely ordinary errand, the kind of small domestic task that makes up most of what grief actually looks like from the inside. as opposed to how it looks from the outside. I found it in the bottom drawer of the dresser beside her bed, and beneath it, folded once, without an envelope, with my name written on the outside in Ianthe's upright handwriting, was a single sheet of cream paper. I sat on the edge of her bed and held it for a moment without opening it. I knew her handwriting better than I knew almost any other physical thing in the world. I had read her handwriting on grocery lists and appointment reminders and margin notes in books, and the label on the manila folder in her desk that said, "When the time comes, do not improvise." I had watched that handwriting change over 6 years, not deteriorate exactly, but economize, each letter becoming slightly more deliberate as the effort required to produce it increased, until by the last year the words were fewer, and the intention behind each one was correspondingly larger. She had stopped writing things that did not need to be written. What remained was only what was necessary. I unfolded the paper. 2 lines, that was all. 2 lines in her handwriting, in the economized script of her last year, each letter formed with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows they are writing something for the last time and wants it to hold. The first line said, "I knew you would stay. That was never the question." The second line said, "The question was whether you would know, when it was over, that staying was the bravest thing." I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Outside the window, the garden was catching the late afternoon light in the way it catches it in early spring, low and gold and slightly sideways, the light of a season that has not yet fully committed, but is moving in that direction with steady, undeniable intention. The oak trees were casting long shadows across the lawn. A bird I could not see was doing something methodical in the hedgerow at the far end of the property, a small repetitive sound, purposeful and unhurried. I thought about August, Ianthe in a wheelchair, declining tea, spending 2 hours building something that would survive her. I thought about the copy placed in the reading room, the fireplace, the recording devices installed the previous week. I thought about Draven's smile as the paper caught. I thought about Lorcan at my door at 5:17 in the morning, his breath a small cloud in the cold air, the black folder under his arm. I thought about 53 days, about oak trees in October and oak trees in March, and the particular persistence of things that have deep roots. I thought about 6 years. About what 6 years looks like from the outside, small and domestic and largely invisible, a woman in someone else's house, managing medications and driving to appointments and reading documents she never planned to read, and what it looks like from the inside, which is different, which is, if I am honest, the accumulation of 1,000 small choices, each one made in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, each one chosen not because it was recognized or rewarded or witnessed, but because it was right, because she needed it, because I was there. I knew you would stay. That was never the question. The question was whether I would know, when it was over, what staying had been. I know now. I folded the letter along its original crease and held it in both hands. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. The photograph of Ianthe's husband was turned slightly away from the window, toward the softer light of the interior, as though he preferred to look at the room rather than the world outside it. The reading glasses were on the side table. Everything was exactly as she had left it. I did not move to change any of it. Some rooms are not meant to be cleared. Some things are not meant to be packed away into boxes and donated and erased. Some things are meant to be stood in for a while, quietly, in the low gold light of an early spring afternoon, not as monuments to grief, but as evidence of presence, as proof that someone was here and that what they built did not burn. Ianthe Whitlock was the most intelligent person I have ever known, not in the abstract, credentialed, publicly legible way that the word intelligent is usually meant, in the way that matters, in the way of someone who understood people, their patterns and their hungers and their particular blindnesses, with the clear, undeceived attention of someone who has been paying careful notice for a very long time. She did not spend her final months in bitterness or fear. She spent them building, quietly, methodically, with the same patient precision she had applied to every other thing she had ever made. She built a trap for the man who meant to take everything, and she built a letter for the woman she knew would stay. The garden outside was still and gold and slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning again. I stayed in that room until the light changed. Before you close this, I want you to know that every word of this story was written with intention, not assembled, not generated by a process indifferent to what it produces. Someone sat with Naira and Ianthe, and the smell of cedar, and the light in that garden and chose every sentence, every pause, every word that landed where it needed to land. The same way Ianthe built her plan. The same way Naira gave her years. With care, and with the belief that what is built carefully does not burn. If this story meant something to you, that's why. And I'll see you in the next one.